Welcome to FLCC's annual Islamic Heritage Month event. This is our regular opportunity to promote greater understanding of the richness and diversity of the world's second largest religion, and to recognize and celebrate the cultural and intellectual contributions of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims and America's 3.3 million. This is also our opportunity to focus attention on major events, developments, and themes in the contemporary Middle East and Islamic world. And this is certainly the case that brings us together today as we welcome Dr. Kira Jumet, Assistant Professor of Government at Hamilton College, who will discuss what motivated thousands of average Egyptians to take part in one of the most significant events to sweep the modern Middle East, the Arab Spring and the nationwide protests against the Mubarak regime in Egypt in 2011. Dr. Jumet received her bachelor's in international relations and Middle Eastern studies from Brown University, her master's degree in Middle Eastern studies from the American University of Cairo. She also has a second master's degree from Rutgers, and also did her doctorate in political science at Rutgers University. Before arriving at Hamilton College in 2016, I think I got the date right, she was Director of Development for the American Iranian Council. When she joined Hamilton in 2016, she has been very active in the government department there. She teaches a range of popular courses on international relations and Middle Eastern politics and foreign policy. And in the 2 brief years that she has been at that institution, she has already been acknowledged as a stellar teacher. Earlier this year, she was a recipient of the John R. Hatch Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Jumet is also a notable scholar. She has produced a slew of articles for publications like the New Middle East and the Northwestern Journal of International Affairs. And her acclaimed book, from which today's talk is drawn, Contesting the Repressive State, was published by Oxford University Press last year. And that is the preeminent publisher of scholarly material. That is what we all aspire to that's the holy grail of academic scholarly publications. Tarek Moussaoud of Harvard University has hailed her book as, quote, an important contribution to our understanding of Egyptian politics, the Arab Spring, and the dynamics of protest. And Edward S. Walker Jr., former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, declared, quote, Professor Jumet has breathed life into the academic study of Egypt's 2011 revolution. This is a fascinating review of events that confounded many experts, including many of my colleagues at the State Department, days before the revolution. I was telling my friends in Cairo, it can't happen here, and yet it did. And Professor Jumet explains exactly why. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Kira Jumet.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm usually a little bit more humble than that. I just said Professor Hamilton. And thank you so much for coming out to hear me speak. If I'm a little off today, I found out yesterday I'm one of the 2% who has a bad reaction to the flu shot. Great. But that's okay, it's under control. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about the Egyptian Revolution, some of the data from my research, but I also want to bring it up to present times, to 2018, and talk about kind of the return to authoritarian rule in Egypt. So what you had in 2011 were these Arab Spring uprisings starting in Tunisia at the end of 2010, where Mohamed Bouazizi, a fruit seller, self-immolated himself, set himself on fire in protests of government corruption, which sparked protests in the country. Then we went on to Egypt, and then of course moved on to Syria and Libya and Yemen and a number of other countries. We saw protests, some leading to the overthrow of the regimes. Some states are still in political conflict and violence. And only Tunisia, unfortunately, was the only one that actually transitioned to a democratic state, whereas Egypt ended up more authoritarian than it was before the revolution. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at why people protested and then what happened between 2011 and 2018 that led to Egypt becoming more authoritarian than it was before. As oftentimes in political science, this is a sad story. I'm still looking for happy stories to talk about in political science, particularly if you do foreign policy and political violence, but not really. So that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the 2018 presidential elections in Egypt, and then start again from the beginning and move forward. Okay? And actually, if anyone has questions in the middle of my talk, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to answer them during if there's something you'd like clarified, and if not, we can wait till the end, and I'll do Q&A as well. Okay? So, obviously this is based on my book, Contesting the Repressive State, Why Ordinary Egyptians Protested During the Arab Spring. I did 15 months of field work in Cairo, Egypt, observing protests, and a lot of political violence, unfortunately. But I also had a long history of being in Egypt. I actually went on study abroad to Egypt when I was a junior in college, and then I did my first master's there, and then I went back for my PhD research. So I've actually lived in Egypt for 5 years altogether. And of course I speak Egyptian Arabic, but for those of you who are not from the Middle East, don't worry, I'm not either. My father is from Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and my mom is Irish, Scottish, German, and yet I learned Arabic. So for those of you who are interested in another area of the world, just remember that where you're from is not a limit to what you can study, okay? Oops. But it is what you can click. Okay. So the research question that we're going to look at is, why did individuals choose to engage or not engage in revolutionary protest under the authoritarian regime? So that's what the research question of the book is. But, and so what I did was I did data collection in Cairo, Egypt, during 2012 and 2013, actually, and also into 2014. And so I did 170 interviews in 46 districts of Cairo with people who either protested or did not protest to understand what was the difference between those populations. So what made certain people protest while others didn't. I had 95 protesters, 75 non-protesters, 101 from the lower class, 33 from the middle class, and 36 from the upper class. And it's really important when you're doing research to try to get a distribution from different social classes, or also try to have a gender balance as well, which I did, because you want to make sure that you're not drawing too much from one group, and then you find out that if I had just studied these other people, I would have ended up with totally different results. So that's something to always keep in mind when you're doing research. So just to kind of let you see what Greater Cairo looks like. So on the right side, so if you see the Nile, it's the blue thing, going through, right? On the right side is Cairo proper, and on the left side is Giza, which is a different governorate. However, what we say of Greater Cairo is the Cairo-Giza area. And so to understand where I did research, pretty much all of this. So I did interviews all the way up to Amarg in the top right, all the way to Shubr al-Khima in the left, all the way down to Ma'adi on the bottom, and to Ga'am al-Khamis, and all the way down to the Giza pyramids. Sometimes research was easier than others. There was a lot of, 2012, there were a number of protests, but it wasn't so intense. 2013 was a lot more difficult, and that's when you learn sometimes you start a research project and you think the conditions are going to be one way, and then you find out you've stepped into a big mess and you have to figure out what to do. So actually, during the 2013 military coup and uprising, following the coup, I had to evacuate the country for 2 weeks. And then I was given a choice whether or not to continue. I was on a boring fellowship, and they said I could go to another country and study Arabic, or if I wanted to go back to Egypt, then I would have to return all $24,000, and go it alone. And because I'm crazy, I returned the money and went back alone. But it paid off in another way because I was one of the only people to have this data. But there are things you don't expect. Additionally, I ended up living in an area with mass political violence where one day 26 people were shot by the military in front of my house. And I conducted research during the Rabaa al-Adawiya sit-in, which was the anti-coup protests in 2013, up until 1 week before the Rabaa massacre, which is considered the largest massacre of protesters in a single day in modern history, according to Human Rights Watch. And so sometimes you end up starting your research in what you think is a happy, calm period post-revolution, and then you find out, oops, no it's not, it's getting much worse. Also, you have other types of challenges when you do research that you might not expect. So Egypt was under military curfew for a number of months. And so I would have to sometimes, if I didn't make it back before curfew, I would be stuck for maybe 10 or 11 hours out at whatever location I was at because I couldn't get back home because I wasn't allowed to travel. Unfortunately, that happened one night when I was doing interviews in a cabaret where I was the only woman not working. And so I spent my evening in a very shady cabaret amongst some arms dealers and prostitutes, but you know, these things happen. So to even understand the left-hand side, there's a Beragil, and I did research there as well, and it was a lot more rural. And so there are some times where you'd end up doing research right in the middle of the city where it's easy to access, and sometimes you go to an area that has dirt roads that actually you can only get to by tuk-tuk because the roads are not fit for even taxis. And so what you realize when you start doing research in another country is that you have to adapt to many different conditions, which helps you to become a more developed person, and that's a nice thing. So the questions that we're going to discuss today are, how did Egypt end up more authoritarian in 2018 than it was in 2010? That was not the plan of the protesters going outside. 2, what factors affected Egyptians' lack of support for democratization post-2011? So a lot of scholars have done research and blamed a whole bunch of structural factors, economic, the military, for the reason that Egypt did not democratize. But what I also look at, I like to look at everyday people, right? So not just big political figures, but why do everyday people do what they do? And that's where the real story is oftentimes. And what you look at is, what I want to look at is why everyday people ended up, who maybe protested against Mubarak, were anti-authoritarian regime, suddenly decided that they were going to support a return to authoritarianism, okay? And then the last is, what did the 2018 presidential elections mean for the future of Egypt? So we're going to cover a lot of material in a very short period of time, and I'm probably going to have to cut myself off because I can talk about this for hours and nobody probably wants to hear that much. So in 2018, spring this year, right, there were presidential elections in Egypt, right, because we're already back to authoritarian rule. And leading up to the elections, there were actually a number of people who wanted to run against Sisi, who is the current president of Egypt and has been since 2014. But somehow all of them were disqualified or arrested. So we have some pretty prominent figures. Colonel Ahmed Kansawa got 6 years in prison for breaking election and military rules by announcing his candidacy while wearing a military uniform, because you're not supposed to, only civilians are allowed to run, right? It should be noted that Sisi, the current president, was head of the military prior to becoming president in 2014. And actually, when he said that he was going to step down and become a civilian, run as a civilian, somebody actually posted on Facebook that Sisi stepping down and saying that he's a civilian president is like Sisi putting on a bra and saying he's the first female president. And so we also have Sami Annan, former head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, another large military figure, who was arrested and charged with document forgery for getting the signatures that he needed to be eligible to run for president, and incitement against the armed forces, so that he wasn't able to run. And then you had Ahmed Shafiq, who was actually in exile in the United Arab Emirates. So he had actually run for president and made it to the last round in the 2012 presidential elections, which were the first democratic elections post-revolution. And then when he lost, he decided to take a long vacation in the UAE. But then the UAE deported him when he said he was going to run in the 2018 elections back to Egypt. And then he was detained and disappeared because of corruption charges. Question in the very back.
Yeah, you have Sami Anan as former head of SCAF.
Yes.
We're kind of going back to the Morsi presidency. Wasn't the SCAF the military instrument of the Morsi government? Didn't they work side by side, really, to kind of try and...
So Sami Anan was actually during the transitional period between 2011 post-revolution, or first Mubarak, and a certain time period before the 2012 elections. Then Tantawi took over from Sami Anan, and then after Tantawi, Morsi actually didn't trust Tantawi, and so he made him retire and appointed Sisi, thinking that Sisi was much more religious and would go along with the Muslim Brotherhood, and it turned out that Sisi orchestrated the coup.
But then going back to this, do you think that the whole argument here is about everyday Egyptians? And do you think that everyday Egyptians really wanted to push towards an Islamist government, which was, through a new constitution, going to repress people of different backgrounds?
So we're actually going to get to that in my talk. So we'll get to all the different nuances of that. We'll probably get there in about 10 minutes. Okay. So Ahmed Shafiq was also detained. So it's really interesting to look at who was even running against Sisi. It was different members of the military. And that's a big deal because he was a military president, and usually you would think the military would then back him. And so when you see that prominent members of the military are running against him for president, it shows that there are fractions within the military and they don't all support the current president, which will make the president potentially more authoritarian and much more nervous, because it's then been publicly demonstrated that he doesn't have the full support of the military. And so going forward, that will probably become more and more of a problem in Egypt. So what ended up, we also have Mohammed Anwar Sadat, the nephew of the former president of Egypt up until 1980s, early 80s, who also dropped out because he said these were definitely not free and fair elections. And then we had Khalid Ali, who was a prominent human rights lawyer who is charged with public indecency. So pretty much everybody who actually had a name, who wanted to run against Sisi, ended up in prison or disqualified or something to that effect. Yes?
So why do they call him a president then if he's basically a dictator? I mean, like the one guy you said disappeared, which basically probably means they probably killed him.
So president does not imply democratic. There's nothing democratic about the term president necessarily. So you can definitely be an authoritarian president. Yes. So there's Shafiq, Sabiada, and Sadat. And then in the final round, and this is very entertaining, the last two candidates were, of course, President Sisi, and then Musa Mustafa Musa, who nobody had heard of before and had been running a pro-Sisi campaign up until right before the election, where he decided to run against Sisi, but not really, and still said that he thought Sisi was wonderful. So you can imagine the results of this election, where Sisi won 97% of the vote, Musa won 3% of the vote, with a turnout allegedly of 41%, but we don't know exactly because we don't have international election monitors, and there's often corruption and overstating of the number of turnouts, right? So let's go back in time a little bit. So that's Hosni Mubarak. Hosni Mubarak was president for about 30 years in Egypt, up until, yes, term limits, not so much. He was president until 2011, February 2011, when he was ousted from, by the revolutionary protests. So that's actually the Facebook invite to the protests. Yes, you can invite people to the protests now. So in leading up to the revolution, there were two large groups that were important for mobilization, particularly on the first day of the January 25th protests. And to remember, January 25th was Police Day in Egypt, where you're supposed to celebrate the police. So they were actually organizing a protest to counter the police and police corruption and torture. And so one group is called the April 6th Youth Movement, and that's their sign. So that says January 25th, day of the Intifada, or the uprising, the Egyptian uprising, right? And it says April 6th, Youth Movement and contact information. So the April 6th Youth Movement started off in 2008 in Mahala Al Kobra, supporting textile workers' strike. But then they also did a lot of political activism and mobilization, mostly online, and then when they did protests in the street, there were usually a few hundred and they got arrested right away. In addition to the April 6th Youth Movement, you had Kulana Khalid Said, which means we are all Khalid Said. And so, not so long before the revolution, there was a young man from Alexandria, Egypt, named Khalid Said, who exposed police corruption through posting videos of the police confiscating drugs and then selling them again, which happens a lot in Egypt. And for that, they actually found him in an internet cafe, and they tortured him to death, which is also very common in Egypt, unfortunately. And what happened is his family circulated two photos, one of Khalid Said in his nice sweater, this young middle-class guy from Alexandria, and then his completely tortured, disfigured body. And it really impacted a lot of Egyptians because they would say, this could actually be me, this could be my son, this could be my, husband. And so people started to be very upset about police brutality, similar to what we see today in the United States with the continuous postings of videos of police brutality against African Americans that happened leading up to the revolution. Was the continuous circulation of videos and postings about police brutality in general and corruption in Egypt, which then fomented a lot of anger. And so they were originally just posting for pushing for justice for Khalid Said, but then they also paired up with April 6th Youth Movement to call for protests on Police Day. So that's what Tahrir Square looked like in Cairo on January 25th, 2011, with thousands of people going out into the streets. And if you look at issues of social media for the first day, social media had a big impact. You don't need social media for a revolution. There have been revolutions for hundreds of years prior to Facebook and Twitter. However, it was an interesting new mobilizing tool. And the reason was because there was an invite, people were able to see how many other people said they were going to go, right? So you know that you're not going to be alone when you go out. And even though those numbers are usually not correct exactly, when usually 100 or 200 people accept an invite, and this time 80,000 people accepted an invite, you know the numbers are going to be bigger than usual. In addition to the numbers, as we know, when you accept an invite on Facebook, you can also see which of your friends are going. And so people would also see, not only do I see this large number of people going out for the first time, all of my friends are going too. And then people would offline then talk to their friends and then say, oh, now I have somebody to go with, and they would go out in groups. And that's how protests started on the 25th. In the back, yes?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, do you think this rally happened, it was so big because of that reason, like friends were just going with friends, or because these people really had the views that everybody was sharing?
So I'm explaining why people go out. So the three main grievances for why people went out were police corruption, the economy, and and corruption in general, and then police brutality and torture, right, which is a big issue in Egypt. There's an article just today about an Egyptian American who is currently being detained in Cairo and has been severely tortured by the regime. So it continues. And so those were the main grievances. But there are plenty of places where people have grievances and they don't protest or try to overthrow their regime, right? We probably have protests in every single country then, right, all the time. And so what happens is you have to, what we would say in social movements theory is it's not just enough to have those grievances. You have to have political actors who then, such as April 6th Youth Movement or the Kulana Khaled Said, who then say, who mobilize people. So what they say is, this is the problem, and everyone says, yes, we all identify with those issues, those are common to everyone. And this is the cause of your problem, the Mubarak regime, and this is what you need to do to fix that problem, right? And that's what social movement organizations do. They frame the issue and they mobilize people based on those grievances. And so that's what happened on the first day of protests. After the first day of protests, on the 25th of January, they actually shut down the internet because they were so afraid of online mobilization. But it was too late by then, and people were mobilizing in other networks, in other ways. And actually, after that, people got most of their information not from social media, but from television, particularly satellite television and the Al Jazeera network. And then after January 25th, which is really interesting, one of the primary reasons people started protesting was because of government violence against protesters. Because people said, I was so angry, these people were just asking for their rights, and the government was shooting at them, and this was being shown all over Al Jazeera television, and so it actually got people so angry they went out into the streets even more. And that's interesting because sometimes government violence will cause people to stay home. In this particular situation, encourage people to go out. So then, there goes, yes?
Do you have to make a distinction between Mubarak's security forces and the actual army? Because the army didn't get involved.
Yes. So, thank you. So the security forces fired on protesters, whereas the military did not. The reason the military did not was because they gain, remember this is not a sectarian country, and so people from the military had their family members protesting in the revolution. The military members who would have been asked to fire on protesters would have been conscripts. And so there was and the military always said that we are a military of the people. So they would have lost their position had they, and the respect of the people, obviously, had they fired on protesters, on top of the fact that they didn't want to shoot their own families, right? So I'm going to have to skip a lot from that year in order to get through everything. But between 2011 and 2012, you had continuous protests. So when Mubarak leaves, you have the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, a military transitional government, take over. Some people will argue that one of the reasons that Tunisia was successful and Egypt wasn't beginning was because Tunisia had a civilian transitional government, whereas Egypt had a military transitional government. So, but the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces took over, and they said they would manage the country until they could hold new presidential elections. In the meantime, they had parliamentary elections, and Islamists, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, dominated those elections and won the largest amount of votes for the parliament. But people continued to protest in the streets now against the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces because they also engaged in shooting of protesters. One in the Maspero incident where a number of Coptic Christians in Cairo were protesting it's a long story, but they were doing a large protest, and the military fired on those protesters, and then also on the Mohammed Mahmoud protest in November of that year, in 2011, where the military and security services working together were actually having eye snipers where they were taking out protesters' eyes. And so some of the people I interviewed actually had lost eyes in the Mohammed Mahmoud protests. And the reason people were really protesting Mohammed Mahmoud and some of the other times during the year was to push GAF toward holding presidential elections because they thought they were taking their time too much. The reason the Egyptian military was worried about elections is because there are no actual solid figures about the Egyptian military's role in the economy because they've always been able to keep those figures hidden, but it's anywhere between 5 and 40% of the economy that the military controls. They have their own companies, they get profits from the Suez Canal, they produce water bottles and pasta, everything. They're in the tourism industry, they have their own private contracts with other countries and other companies separate from the regime, to the point where the military actually lent the Egyptian government money when it was not doing well post-revolution. So the military was afraid of too much civilian control that would threaten its economic interest. Anyway, so eventually in 2012, presidential elections are held. The first round was May 23rd and May 24th of 2012. And what you ended up with was a whole bunch of different candidates. And people were very excited about these elections because they finally had a choice, right? And the majority of the candidates could be considered liberal or progressive candidates. However, the majority of people in the first round voted for liberal or progressive candidates. Unfortunately, because there were so many, they split the vote. And so the two candidates who ended up having the most votes afterwards for the second round, it was Mohammed Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood, who was their second choice because their first choice got disqualified, so some people called him the spare tire. And Ahmed Shafiq, who was a former aviation minister under Mubarak. And so in nice terms, I'll say that the general statement that was being made across Cairo at the time was that the choice was between poop and poop. That's the nice way to say it. And the reason was because they said, well, there were 20 to 30% of people in Egypt at the time who were supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. That wasn't still not the majority of the people, and Muslim Brotherhood, while it did have some time periods where it participated in the political process and fielded candidates in fraudulent elections under Mubarak, at other times when they were being repressed by the regime, they engaged in violence, and so some people saw them as a terrorist organization, while other people saw them through their community role as a social service organization that provided health care and financing to the poor. So there were different views of the Muslim Brotherhood in that country. On the other side, you have Ahmed Shafiq, and people said, we just had a whole entire revolution to get rid of the Mubarak regime, and now a guy from the Mubarak regime is in the final round of the elections. What's going on? So a lot of people wanted to boycott the elections. Mohammed Morsi promised the people that he would, in the Fairmount Agreement, that he would have an inclusive government that represented all the different parties, and then so he got a lot of the liberal parties to give him a chance and vote for him, and that's how he won. And so the final vote was Morsi 52%, Shafiq 48%, with a 52% turnout. And so after Morsi's 100 days in power, it got, yes?
Wasn't there a major push, though, to have the Constitution in place before the actual presidential elections to see?
That's what we're about to do. Yes.
And that's the protests that were rising up. And SCAF helped put them down, didn't they?
For the Constitution. Yeah, so we're doing that right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So Morsi's first 100 days in power didn't go as well as people wanted. There's also a lot of expectations after a revolution where people think, well, if we got rid of Mubarak, then we can fix everything right away. And unfortunately, Morsi didn't temper those expectations, and so when everything wasn't fixed in 100 days, people started to get disgruntled. But then what really set people off to protest against Morsi was the Constitutional Declaration of November 22nd, 2012. So post-revolution, there was a constitutional constitutional committee created, and the rules of the committee were actually set by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And it had to be a representative committee that represented all different areas of society to create the Constitution, and members of Parliament were not allowed to be on the committee, but they were allowed to choose the committee. Well, when Parliament was active for the short time before it got dissolved by the constitutional courts because they said that there were problems with those elections, although people will say that the constitutional courts, the judiciary was still from the Mubarak regime and didn't want Islamist parties in power. The Parliament actually put their own members on the court. So what happened was it wasn't really as diverse as it was supposed to be, and parliamentary members were participating in the committee. So the courts dissolved it. Then it got reconstituted, but then there were still fights because it was really Islamist dominated, and then the other groups felt like they were just going to have to be rubber stamped on Islamist dominated constitution. So what happened was the non-Islamists on the committee resigned and said, thought that would cause the court to be dissolved, the committee to be dissolved again. But instead, Morsi made a constitutional declaration which said that they were going to hold a referendum within a month on the Constitution, and if the people didn't vote yes, then he would hold dictatorial powers until a constitution was passed. People also said that this was the reason he put out the constitutional declaration then was because he knew that there was a big possibility that the committee was about to be dissolved again by the courts. And so he wanted to preempt that. So this constitutional declaration led to mass protests in Cairo. And in December 5th, 2012, you see the Ittihadiyya clashes where people were protesting against the constitutional declaration. They were really furious. And it was really awful because the Muslim Brotherhood was afraid that the security forces wouldn't protect Morsi. And so they actually sent out the Muslim Brotherhood militias to the presidential palace to protect him. And there were cases of Muslim Brotherhood setting up outdoor torture chambers and detaining people. And so after the violence that occurred in the Ittihadiyya clashes, people said, talking about Morsi, quote, he was legitimate. When Ittihadiyya happened and blood was spilled, he wasn't. And he was because he won the election, but he wasn't when he sent guys out to beat up his own citizens. So people started to lose a little bit of faith in democracy in the 2012 presidential elections based on who were the candidates in the second round, because that's not what they had imagined. And then what happened is Morsi, while he was democratically elected, he did not act democratically once he was in power. And then Egyptians' understanding of democracy changed. You don't really have, there's democracy in concept and democracy in practice. They had never had democracy in practice. Once they had it, then they said, oh, it's not just elections, it's also what you do in power. And they started to lose faith in democracy because then Morsi started to act very authoritarian, which was not what they'd expected from a democratic process. And so they started to lose faith, and people would say, everyone just wants the chair, is what they would say, that everyone just wants power. And so in the constitutional referendum on December 15th and 22nd, people said, I didn't participate if it related to Morsi. The referendum was a fraud. I thought there was no difference if I voted, and quote, I didn't vote because I couldn't feel my own value to make a change in the community by voting. And so people continued to lose their faith in elections, particularly when he holds what they consider to be a fraudulent referendum and kind of bullying through a constitution. And so there was a progressive erosion of faith in democracy post-revolution. Also, people started to pit the concept of protest against elections. So people said, quote, elections didn't matter, the evidence was the January 25th revolution. So they realized the power of the people and their ability to overthrow the Mubarak regime by protest, but they weren't making much progress with elections. And that's not necessarily helpful to start trying to create a stable democracy. They said, it comes from the people, about democracy, not the ballot box, because you can play with the ballot box. And, quote, democracy is not just the ballot box, it is a process that is every day. People can take the government down before 4 years if the government doesn't fulfill its promises. They can take them down in any way, by protests or by the Constitution. So people started to think that, and this is where instability comes from, if I don't like, not just this person, if this person isn't acting democratically, but if I just don't like what he's doing, that I can just protest and make him go away. And so people's concepts of democracy started to change, and they also had very low faith in elections. Okay. Yeah. So on June 30th, 2013, you ended up with mass protests of estimated, probably a little overestimated, but 30 million people taking to the streets to ask for Morsi to go. And so that started with the Tamarud movement that started earlier in the 2013 year, which means a rebel. And they were doing what everyone thought was a grassroots movement to overthrow Morsi and then do a new transitional government and hold elections again because he wasn't being democratic. What people didn't know is the Tamarud movement ended up getting co-opted by the military and the security services, who also were not in favor of Morsi. And so they started to provide logistical support to the Tamarud movement, but the people didn't know this. They thought it was just grassroots. Also, the UAE and Saudi Arabia provided financial support to the Tamarud movement because they were unhappy with the Arab Spring, because they wanted to keep their monarchies and authoritarian rule in their countries, and if Egypt went fully democratic, it would be a threat to their rule. So they were happy to see the overthrow of Morsi and a return to military rule in Egypt. And also some of the big businessmen from the Mubarak era, and this is what we call the deep state, right? That you can't get really rid of, even if you change the president, you don't necessarily change the primary actors. And they were also financing the Tamarud movement, but people didn't know this until after. So that's actually why I call it a popular participatory veto coup, which is not the sexiest term, but whatever. And it's because usually you see a military coup by a military junta, a small group of military members. The military actually co-opted a movement and got 30 million people out in the streets to help them do a military coup, which is pretty impressive. So on June 30th, although the protests really started about the 28th, they started protesting against Morsi, and by July 3rd, Morsi was ousted. And by ousted, that means that they first step in a coup, secure the leader, and make him disappear. That's why it didn't work in Turkey, but that's another story. And so they took over the country, and it was great. They had all these different, the head of Al-Azhar, and then the head of the Coptic church, and all of these different players from all different areas of society saying, oh, we're going to get, we're so happy about the removal of Morsi, and now we're going to do a transitional government. So they have a new transitional government. Adli Mansour, who's the head of parliament, takes over. But it's a puppet government because the real power is with the military at this point. And then they hold presidential elections in 2014. And so, but before we get there, I'll just quickly say, at the same time that they had the June 30th protests against Morsi that led to his downfall, on the 28th, the Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamists, and non-aligned people who were just upset about the coup started the Rabal Adawaya and Nahda sit-ins in Cairo to protest the coup and support legitimacy, is what they said. And that sit-in continued until August 14th. 2013, and that's when the military went after the protesters and conducted the Rabaa massacre and killed over 1,000 people that day. And the independent people were really just saying, where's my vote? I voted for the parliament, they dissolved it. I voted for the president, there was a coup. So what's going on? Yes? Rabaa. Rabaa al-Adawiyya. I can spell that for you after if you'd like. Yeah. Oh, I put it in speed. There we go. And so that's what the Rabaa massacre, the Rabaa sit-in looked like prior to the massacre. You had women and children and families there, and they actually conducted the massacre 1 week after after the Eid holiday, which was pretty horrific. And so there was a lot of then violence in the country in 2013 based on different people being upset about what happened. And people started to be afraid. And the military really pushed this idea of fear, right, and chaos. Yes, there was violence around the country, but what they also did is they started labeling the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, which they hadn't before. And on July 26th, prior to the Rabaa massacre, they'd actually called for the people to come into the streets to support the military and fight terror. And on the TV screens in Egypt, on the state TV, in the right-hand corner, it would consistently say, Egypt fighting terror. And so really starting to freak people out all the time about, instability in the country. And there's also the regional effects of seeing what was going on in other countries at the time, Libya, which is on Egypt's border, and then also Syria, right? And so one person said, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but do you think that if we have a civilian as president, the military will listen to him if he says, let's go to Sinai to fight ISIS, let's go to Libya to fight whomever? Do you think the military will even blink? They wouldn't listen to him because they wouldn't respect him. That's the mind of the military people. And so people just wanted their stability, and they thought that the only way to get stability was to have the military as their savior, and a civilian president could not stop the chaos. And so actually what people were starting to say was that Egypt isn't ready for democracy. So when you look at the Arab Barometer or the World Values Survey from that time period, you saw that people still technically supported democracy. But what people said on the ground was, yes, I'm in favor of democracy, just not now. Because right now we're in chaos and we need a military leader to provide stability. And even prior to the 2011 revolution, when you looked at the World Values Survey, people did not have a problem, and actually the majority of Egyptians, I think it was, said that they were in favor of a military safety net for democracy or for the institutions of power. So people didn't actually see a conflict between military power and democracy. But people said that Egypt wasn't ready because of lack of education, culture, and poverty, which is interesting because prior to the revolution, that's what some scholars were saying, and they were, criticized for saying, oh, the Arab states can't democratize and they don't have the culture. But then the Egyptians were starting to say it about themselves, which was a little bit crazy. So what you have to look at is not only did people have these ideas that started to form that were anti-democratic based on what had occurred since the revolution, they also took anti-democratic actions, right? So it's not just about opinion surveys or interviews, but observing what people did. They participated in a coup on June 30th, 2013 to remove a democratically elected president. They were supporting military crackdowns by participating in the July 26th protests. And the response to Rabaa al-Adawiyya was incredibly positive. And so a large portion of the Egyptian population was cheering on the military as it slaughtered the Muslim Brotherhood and anti-coup activists, which was a really terrifying time. Yes?
Yeah, do you think any of this goes back to maybe Nasser's influence and the free officers, and that seemed to be, he's been lionized within Egyptian civilization, Egyptian culture?
Not so much, actually. In this particular case, while people do like their subsidies, which is why people like Nasser and Sadat and Mubarak removed those subsidies because Egypt couldn't afford to have a populist authoritarian rule, there wasn't actually that very much talk of Nasser at that time.
Do you think the economic downturn at the time also precipitated the economic fall with the state sector? Like the world economic meltdown?
No, actually. The economic situation had not changed that much as you would think. If you were going to look at economic causes of protests, most people were mad about police brutality and corruption.
Well, weren't a lot of subsidies cut, like everything from food to milk, like
no, actually.
Government provided subsidies.
Actually, what happened, if you want to go into the economic issues of the time, post-revolution, the Egyptian economy was in a bad way because obviously revolutions mess with an economy, and then there's instability and foreigners don't want to invest and all that kind of stuff. In order to keep the Egyptian pound afloat, they used foreign currency reserves to prop up the Egyptian pound that was originally the policy of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, taken over by Morsi.
How about pre-revolution?
Pre-revolution?
Yeah. Did you see the economy slip?
It was not like the 77 bread riots, no. It was not. Economic reasons, when you actually look at the data, the economic situation wasn't good, but it hadn't been good for a long time. There wasn't some massive drop in Egypt post-2008, if that's what you're implying. Okay. Yeah, it was more perception and just continuous poverty rather than a particular instance of economic activity. So what happens is kind of the final element of this anti-democratic wave in Egypt. I'll give you 1 second. Anti-democratic wave in Egypt is that in 2014, people voted for Sisi into the presidency because he was running against Sabahi, who had actually come in third in the 2012 presidential elections. But these were so that's Sabahi and that's Sisi, but those were the actual results. He seems to get 97 every time. The turnout was overstated by people who I know who actually did do informal election monitoring. They also extended the time to vote to try to get more people to vote. Sisi did clearly win at that time, but probably not 97%. Although Egyptians also have a thing where if they're against the candidate that they think is going to win, they just don't vote at all. So that also skews the vote higher toward the winning candidate. And so, wait, do you want me to ask the question?
With each realization of power to a new person, would it be safe to say that the protests just got larger and larger each time to make a full change?
Not after 2014. So what happened is November 2013, right? The government put in new anti-protest rules, and anybody who was protesting would end up with prison sentences or massive fines, and they tried to just stop the protests altogether. So that was about the time where that didn't continue to occur. So, I know I'm over. Can I do a little more? Okay. So, you get excited about the topic. So, if we look at Egypt's future, some of the major issues we look at are human rights, the economy, and terrorism. So in terms of human rights, there are major NGO restrictions now, non-governmental organizations. Human Rights Watch actually had to flee the country and no longer has an office there after they put out the report on Rabaa Adawiya. They're shutting down pretty much all foreign NGOs. It's really hard to get a license, and they're also shutting down Egyptian NGOs and detaining people who participate in them. There's an increase and reoccurrence of forced disappearances, where the forced disappearances are when the police grab you off the street and detain you and don't let anybody know where you are and move you around so that you can't be found and you're not registered in the system. And there's an increase in torture. It's also become, there are more crackdowns on Islamists and non-Islamists as well. Anybody from any area of the country who or political spectrum who's opposed to the regime. They're now getting terrorism charges. So in Egypt, you usually got spying charges before, but now it's terrorism charges. So everyone's a terrorist. And then in October of 2015, they learned from their mistakes with social media in 2011, and they increased surveillance and their capabilities of surveilling Facebook, Skype, Twitter, and YouTube by getting equipment from Sea Egypt, which is a sister company of an American cybersecurity firm, which is not a surprise, but of course the United States and private industry, as well as the government, provides technical support to authoritarian regimes to repress their citizens. We're in favor of democracy at home and abroad. And then we have the case of Giulio Regeni in 2016, which is why many scholars of Egypt have not gone back recently. Giulio Regeni was an Italian PhD student at Cambridge University who was studying labor, actually, and he got spotted by the regime for just studying labor, not even something not as contentious as you would think, and he disappeared in 2016, and then they found his body on the side of the road. He had been tortured to death, really horrifically tortured to death over 10 days. His nails were pulled out, and he died from, he had cigarette burns, he had been electric shock tortured, and he died from, they had severed his spine. And so after that, people don't want to research in Egypt. And so they've really cracked down on any kind of research in the country. It's way more authoritarian than the time of Mubarak. These things did not happen. And while there's always been torture, foreign researchers and foreigners have usually been deported. This is the first time we've seen a foreign researcher murdered by the regime. Looking at the economy post-2011, currency reserves, the currency reserves depleted. As I said, in November of 2012, they had to stop propping up the pound with the foreign currency reserves. The price of the Egyptian pound to the dollar went up, but then now what we're seeing is in November 2016, they decided to float the currency, and the value of the pound has dropped by 50% against the dollar, and it's, if you can imagine, when I first went to Egypt in even in 2012, it was 5 point something to the dollar, and now it's 17 point something to the dollar, so it's that dropped that much. While Morsi was afraid to take an IMF package because he didn't want to implement austerity measures because he was afraid it would cause instability, Sisi now wants that $12 billion IMF loan, so he's implemented austerity measures, including subsidy cuts on electricity. Sugar prices are at 40%, and Egypt has foreign investment problems. On the terrorism area, post-2013 coup, we've seen a rise in terrorism in the country, particularly because there are no peaceful outlets for dissent. So the Muslim Brotherhood continued to try to protest peacefully after the Rabaa al-Adawiyah massacre, but the response by the regime was to shoot peaceful protesters, to imprison them, or people had to go into exile or into hiding. And so when there are no peaceful ways of participation, then you see waves of terrorism, which is kind of how Egypt has gone for the past, 70 years. More repression leads to higher terrorism rates. You see Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which turned into Wilayat al-Sina, which is ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula operating. They started during the revolution bombing the Egyptian gas pipelines to Israel, but now they've continued on pretty much causing terror in that region. There have been 700 civilians and 1,000 police and soldiers killed in terrorist attacks since Sisi took over. And in October of 2015, a Russian plane was bombed by the Islamic State in the Sinai as well. And so Sisi says that he's killed 2,500 terrorists and arrested 16,000 more. But then again, it's hard to see the numbers because everybody's a terrorist in Egypt now, not just people who are actually committing terrorist acts, anyone who's against the regime. So those numbers are a little bit fuzzy. But what we do see is that while the military claims that it needs to be in power because it maintains stability in the country, in reality, their repressive actions have led to greater instability, an increase in terrorism, and the economy is shooting down. However, people have protest fatigue, and you probably won't see another revolution. I mean, they did two in 2 years. They're probably not going to see another one anytime soon. So that's the sad story of Egypt. And then you can just see, this is my last slide. I'm going to skip that part, but I will talk about 2015, the military court convicted 26 officers of plotting a coup. And Sisi recently fired his defense chief and spy chief. And there are discussions that he might change term limits because he's on his last term. And so what we see is probably a continuation of deeply repressive authoritarianism in Egypt, particularly because the US is the major ally to Egypt and it's not calling out Egypt on human rights abuses anymore under the current presidency. And just as we've seen in the past week with Saudi Arabia's murder and dismemberment of a Saudi journalists in their embassy in Turkey, for those of you who are not aware of the situation going on right now. And so when regimes are not called out then, and they are supported with technical support from foreign powers, then they have free rein to be repressive toward their own people. The end.
This is slightly off topic, but I can't resist the temptation, given your, the insights that you can offer over your experience on American Iranian conflict. What are your thoughts about the Iranian nuclear?
The Iranian nuclear deal. So we're in a in terms of the U.S. policy toward it. Is that okay?
Is the Trump administration adopting that as was the Obama regime?
Honestly, the current administration has created a disaster in U.S. Diplomacy, and the reason for that is that what we've done, the aim of the nuclear deal was to curb Iranian nuclear proliferation. It was not to deal with other issues in terms of Iran. We have a lot of issues with Iran. It is particularly to curb nuclear proliferation. And Iran agreed to the highest and most thorough IAEA checks on their nuclear program in this deal of any country that has ever agreed to. It was a multilateral, it's not a bilateral deal, it's a multilateral deal with the P5+1, who are our allies. When you have a multilateral deal, and it took quite a long time, and you pull out of that, you're not only demonstrating that the US is unreliable, because the idea is when you sign a deal, it doesn't matter who the president is, even if the next president is opposed to it, he will maintain it because it shows that the US is consistent and they're not just abandoning a deal after they made it. And so by abandoning it, it says to the world that whatever deal the US makes, it's only good for that presidency and it's not good going forward. So no state is going to denuclearize and get rid of their program and destroy their facilities, and then a new president comes and says, just kidding, right? Because now you're screwed. So that's really bad for the US in that way. It's also bad for the US because we've screwed over our allies. So if we want to engage in any type of negotiations on any type of issue in a multilateral setting in the world, nobody's going to want the US to be part of those discussions because the US might agree to a deal and then pull out on it, right? And so we've not only created a problem, in addition to that, what we've done is that we're the ones who broke the deal, not Iran. So Iran doesn't look bad in this situation because it has maintained its end of the bargain. So now the United States is perceived in the international community as the rogue state, not Iran, because we don't fulfill our commitments. So if you want to look at why Kim Jong will never be able to make a deal with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, it's because why in the world would he make a deal with the United States when he just saw what the US did with Iran? Whatever deal that we make with we might not fulfill later on. And so our reliability is considered zilch now, and people don't want to, even our allies don't want to negotiate with us. To the point where what we did with the Iran deal is we said to our allies, because our allies who participated in this multilateral negotiation said, fine, the US is pulling out, but we're staying in. Iran, please continue to abide by the deal. We're still in, and please keep agreeing to these IAEA checks. Well, now the US not only pulled out of the deal, we told our allies and the other members of this deal that if they stay in it and fulfill their obligations, then we're going to put sanctions on them. So now we've threatened our allies for upholding the agreement that everybody had made, and so we've also not only antagonized Iran and given them pretty much free rein to proliferate, but we've also antagonized our allies. So that's not a really good situation. We did nuclear week in class last week. Yeah.
Do you think Egypt has a future in terms of the government? I think become a prosperous country, they have such a bold history, but
unfortunately, I would say we never know in the long term, and we always hope for the best in the future. In the short term, things are not looking good for Egypt. The economy is not doing well. There's still a problem of trust for foreign investment, particularly because it's such an authoritarian regime, and because now that the military is fully in power, it's really taking over even more of the economy. And to understand how bad that can be with the economy, let's say the military has conscripts, right? And they take over a road project instead of giving it to a private company because they have free labor, so they're the lowest bidder. They have the lowest price in a bid every time because they have free labor. And so what happens then is they disrupt the economy by taking on all those contracts, and the money doesn't go to the military as a whole, it goes to a bunch of high-up generals, and then private companies don't get those contracts. So the military seems to be encroaching on the economy further and further, which does not bode well for the economy.
So I guess, do you think there will be another revolution following soon or in the future?
I don't think you're going to see another revolution anytime soon. A lot of people have left the country. There's kind of a brain drain going on where a lot of young elites are saying there's nothing for me here, and they're trying to get out. And people are tired. I mean, a revolution, this is real. I mean, I have a friend who was shot 8 times during the revolution. People were killed, hundreds of people were killed. Property was damaged. It's exhausting to have protests every day, and they just don't want to do it anymore. So, I mean, also we have to be not too antsy about results of revolutions because we want everything really quickly nowadays, but if you look at the French Revolution, they didn't get it right for quite a long time after. They had Napoleon, they had the Reign of Terror, they had all of these different things happen before they ended up as a stable democratic republic. And so one hopes that what has happened now is just the beginning of a long haul that has given people the foundations to democratize, maybe in the long term, but probably not in the short term. In the back.
When you were asked to return the grant money in order to return to Egypt and continue with your work, was that them trying to remove any culpability in case you were injured or killed?
Yeah, so a couple weeks before we were evacuated, there was a student from AMID East who was killed in a protest in Alexandria, and then everybody on American programs post-coup were required to leave the country, which is why I ended up being one of the only people with this type of data, is because everybody else was not permitted to go back without with U.S. financing. Yes?
Because so much of the economy is controlled by the government, is that still considered a capitalistic system? Or is it kind of a different economic system because it's so government controlled?
So Egypt's economy is a little bit complicated. So under Nasser, so Egypt was a monarchy but also had British rule. In 1952 there was a military coup that overthrew the monarchy. There was one president, but then like a year later he did a coup. There was another coup, and then Nasser took over, right? And Nasser had populist authoritarian policies, so his idea was to have, the government had most control of the economic sector, and he gave lots of subsidies to everybody to make them happy, right? But that wasn't really sustainable. Egypt is not an oil country, it doesn't have that many resources. So when Sadat took over after Nasser's death, he started the Infitah policy, which is the open door economic policy, which, pairing with international organizations, IMF, that kind of idea, they did structural adjustment in the country, and the idea was that they were going to go to a more capitalist system and privatize. However, they didn't privatize fairly, of course not. What they did is they shifted authoritarian rule from populist, where you have the support of the whole country, to having a small circle of elite. So what they did is when they sold off the public companies, they sold it to elites who would then be thankful to the regime and then would support the regime and it wasn't the most competitive pricing, right? And so that's how he kind of shifted the economy. So then it became more like a capitalist economy, but with so much corruption because the way that there wasn't fair competition, it was giving, benefits to people, a small elite that would support the regime. Mubarak, they also did land reforms at that time and redistribution of land away from the masses to the elites, and Mubarak continued with that. The military continues with that type of policy, except the elite circle, I would say, is even smaller. So there are still private elites that benefit from the regime, but the military is now benefiting more than it did under Mubarak economically.
So it's technically capitalism,
but not really.
Reality.
Yeah, the really bad form of it in terms of the functioning of the economy. Yeah.
We better call it a wrap because some of us have 2 o'clock classes. If anyone wants to remain behind for a few minutes,
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.